firstly, welcome, Shameela. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. Morning, everybody.
What got you interested in climate change and sustainability? Are you one of those do-gooders who wants to save the planet?
I think if you live in South Africa, you can't not be interested in sustainability. If we look at the catch-all phrases that become popular now, ESG and the like, the issues that we're talking about have been part and parcel of our architecture in the country for as long as we can remember. And then my interest really was spurred by background being in corporate strategy. And one of the key roles of a strategist is to understand all the trends, political, economic, social, and the like, and what that means for business. And probably a good 15, 20 years back for me, already the issues that we now call sustainability in a kind of more easy catch-all have been very, very much a part of what I had seen starting to develop and become more impactful for business. So that is really where my interest grew. And then the recognition that business is going to have a critical role to play in achieving those aims of sustainable development and effectively these outcomes that we're going to depend on for our survival. Simple as that.
I mean, there's something Bruce was saying, you know, if we don't look after the planet, we're not going to have a planet, we're not going to have a business.
No.
So it's in business's best interest to preserve the only planet we have.
It absolutely is. Unfortunately, it's not as easy to see. And again, Bruce mentioned very clearly the entrenched short-termism that we tend to pursue. But within that, we also need to acknowledge that the business models that we have, in many ways, are actually not a complete reflection. So if we look at what we pursue, generally it's a simple issue of look at the profit, look at the cost, so look at the revenue, look at the cost, and therefore what's the profit, and do we go for it or not? That cost line item is usually severely underrepresented.
Yes.
And so it effectively incentivizes perverse behavior.
Well, let's double-click on that. I can talk like a consultant. Let's double-click on that, although that's probably like 10 years out of date. Nowadays, they say, what's the solve? What's the solve? So people are not factoring the cost of what it costs the environment. So they're only saying, well, it only costs us petrol and wear and tear. They're not saying, actually, the road's decaying, the air quality's getting worse, the water's getting worse, all these little bits of plastic we keep selling end up in the rivers, end up in the ocean. Is that part of the unseen cost that businesses are just not getting?
Absolutely. We talk about ecosystem services firstly. You know, when we step outside and you're breathing this air in, there's an entire ecosystem that has to work to produce that air for you to breathe. Do you put a cost on that? Or do you start putting a cost on ill health when that air no longer actually supports you and starts creating issues, respiratory issues and the like? And so those are some of the things we don't immediately factor in. And we, you know, often in sustainability, we talk about that the externalization or the internalization of externalities effectively, which we don't do very well. We're starting to see that change as we're starting to see things like prices come in. We talk about a carbon tax. So starting to actually cost those things and saying there's a cost involved is starting to change the way we look at profit and loss.
And you have to, because firstly, it's the only planet, and secondly, as much as we want people to be more foresightful or companies to be more foresightful and see what's coming down the road, the bottom line is if you don't factor into it, if you don't worry that your customers are getting sicker, you're not going to have customers.
Yes, you have to factor that in, right? But then, of course, there's the other incentive, which is, well, actually, maybe there's a perverse incentive in people getting sicker because then there's another industry that profits from that. But what we need to be considering is what does that overall mean for well-being? And do we start measuring that?
Yes.
And what, for example, I mean, I come from a strong financial markets background. When we're investing and we have pension funds, probably everybody in this room is invested in the market. What actually are you investing in? Ultimately, what do you want? You're taking that money out. You want to retire with that. But what sort of situation are you going to be retiring into? And you might have a fantastic pension fund, and every year you look at that bottom line, it's generating 10% returns or whatever is your benchmark. And you get to the end of that, and you're using 50% of that pension fund to pay for water, to pay for security, to pay for just general, you know, sort of things that you should be taking for granted. So the production of that profit that you're depending on for that is really the thing we need to be starting to think about. and contributing to understanding how that came about and how that can be done differently so we actually build a future that we want to retire into.
And they're great points, and it's probably a useful segue into what does the National Business Initiative do and what is its goals?
Oh, certainly. Thank you. So the NBI it's a non-profit organization, and it brings together businesses, government, and civil society to promote sustainable development in the country. And that sounds quite like a high and lofty ideal. But being a voluntary coalition of both local businesses and multinationals working together explicitly to look at environmental sustainability and to look at social transformation, I think is really important. And what it's really doing is acknowledging that this needs to be a united effort. And we've seen that point brought up a few times today. If we really consider the fact that what we need is a systems change, no one entity can do that on its own. We can make our individual contributions, but we need the collective impact to drive to that goal that we need to all reach as society. And there's a role to play for government, business, civil society, all together to do that. And of course, a lot is driven by individual choice.
Indeed, it does. I mean, there was another good point, and I'm sorry to keep harking back to Bruce. I will speak about the Nobel Peace Prize winners soon, I promise, Colleen. But it's a point you also made, which is people don't understand the consequences of their actions. No one poaches because they hate climate change, or they're climate change denialists. They do it because they have a pressing, urgent need, which is usually hunger. Businesses are quite different, though. Businesses understand that they've got to plan for the future and that they've got to know what the consequences of their actions will be. And that's a different kettle of fish, isn't it? They can, in a way, show people how it's done.
They have the massive opportunity to show people how it's done. But it does need to begin with an explicit consideration of the full sets of impacts that you have. When you're talking about sustainability, and I'm going to go very quickly to broadly the reporting elements that business often do in relation to sustainability, there's this concept of double materiality that one needs to consider. And that really says, what are the outside-in impacts of a number of these issues, right, that we consider in the sustainability context, social issues, environmental issues, and the like. And so how does that impact my business, and therefore how will I react? But there's a second part that says, what do I do as a business that actually impacts on those outcomes for society, for the environment, and the like? And how should I be looking at that in the context of my business model and potentially saying, is there an opportunity to relook at that business model to deliver different outcomes, different impacts, and actually start creating an entire different way of being that we know is necessary, and Bruce touched on that earlier. And so that is the concept I think that businesses need to entrench now, is explicitly making an effort to consider how their models currently exist, both from an outside-in and an inside-out perspective.
So you're alleging business can change their behavior?
It absolutely can.
And I suppose the incentive, because they'll make more money if they do the right thing.
Well, they should. They should be able to do that,
Yeah.
But again, it's a systems change, because it's not easy, not linear immediately.
Yeah.
It's a system that we need to look at. And there's different elements of that system that come together to ultimately, yes, say you can do well and do good, to sort of borrow a bit of a cliched term.
So, and in your experience, when you speak to these CEOs and the other people involved in the initiative, do they get it? They know this is mission critical for the planet.
I think that intuitively most people do get it. The reality is you're fighting a system where you feel like you're going against a tide. If you're being measured still by your shareholders and your stakeholders on the bottom line, and the pressure on the CEO is for this return and that's it, that incentive is there not for them to focus on the longer term. It is for the shorter term.
Yeah.
So that is something that we need to learn to start changing and shifting. And how do we do that? It's going to start from the bottom up. Each of us is a consumer. Each of us has something that you can say to the company that you buy from. Each of us is potentially in a pension fund that has trustees. Are you engaging with them to ask them what they're investing in, how that investment was created? What does it do? So we need to consider that we each have a power to do that. And when an investor knocks on the door of that company and says, I don't like what you're doing, or I would prefer that you did this, or actually, can you share with me your climate policy? That's a huge impact, right? They are going to listen.
Yeah.
Because the shareholder is now asking, the investor is now asking. But that investor ultimately is you and I.
Indeed, and if they don't answer, we'll put him on Bruce Whitfield's show.
Absolutely. I was on
let
that
him
show, I
rip.
don't want to be there.
Yeah. So just a couple of final questions. I mean, the importance of this just transition is critical. Most right-thinking people get it. We know you can't keep pumping fossil fuels. The air quality in Mpumalanga is diabolical. People are dying, literally dying from pollution. We can't get away from the just transition. How are you finding businesses are working with this and this implementation?
Yes, I mean, particularly those businesses active in those areas certainly are taking that seriously. And yes, you are talking about the larger polluters and the emitters. So I think that firstly is very encouraging, that there are definitely programs looking at that, looking at how do you transition out of that. Unfortunately, yes, we sort of are tied to coal for the near term, at least for now, but that transition needs to happen quickly. What we are starting to see is a lot more, I think, united effort happening to see, well, what is that region in particular, and hopefully then replicable in other regions, that needs to be done to move people out of the coal value chain, to whether to reskill or what needs to happen, and to relook at the kinds of opportunities for work in those areas. And that is absolutely something that business needs to do together with government. So behind the scenes, I think we're certainly seeing that activity happening. There's the Presidential Climate Commission that's working on issues like that, and business is very much a part of those discussions. So that is encouraging. Of course, the test is going to be the action. And we're hoping we'll see some of that happen in the very near future.